All right, ready to dive in. Today we are unpacking one heck of an interview. You know the one? Dr. Jordan Peterson, Kathy Newman, Channel 4 News, back in 2018.
Oh yeah, that one threw gasoline on the cultural firestorm.
It was more than just an interview. People were dissecting every word, every pause, every eyebrow raise.
And it went completely viral, for good reason too. It touched on so many hot-button issues.
Gender roles,
The patriarchy.
political correctness, the whole nine yards.
Peterson's not one to shy away from a good debate.
He's got a unique way of looking at the world, to say the least. Remember that whole all-beef diet thing?
Yeah, that was a conversation starter.
Almost like he's saying, I'm doing things my way, regardless of what society says. Which leads perfectly into my next question.
Ah.
What were the core ideas Peterson brought to that interview?
Well, he's really big on this whole order versus chaos thing. He even wrote a book about it, 12 Rules for Life. He sees these as like fundamental forces in the universe, not just society.
So order, like structure, stability, the known.
Exactly. And chaos, well, that's the unknown, the unpredictable. It's dangerous, but also full of potential. Peterson's argument is that we as a society have veered way too far into chaos.
Hence his big focus on personal responsibility.
It's like he's saying personal responsibility, that's our anchor, you know?
Yeah.
The thing that keeps us grounded when everything else is chaotic. When we take responsibility, we find meaning, we build a foundation that can weather those inevitable storms.
It makes sense. I mean, who doesn't want more meaning in their life?
Yeah.
More stability. But Peterson doesn't shy away from some of the more, shall we say, primal aspects of human nature either. Like when he talks about men needing to be dangerous, controlled but dangerous, like a well-trained dog.
Yeah, I remember that. It definitely ruffled some feathers.
But it's powerful imagery, you have to admit.
It is, and I think it ties into his larger point about integrating our darker impulses, that aggression, that drive for dominance. Those are parts of us too. We can't just pretend they don't exist. Which is where his critique of what he calls radical leftist thought comes in. He sees that as trying to suppress those fundamental parts of who we are.
Leading to dot tyranny. A select few deciding what's acceptable for the rest of us.
That's the gist of it, yeah.
But here's where it gets really interesting, because Kathy Newman, she challenges him directly on this whole dominance hierarchy thing. She brings up the patriarchy, calls it a patriarchal tyranny even, argues that this system, the one Peterson seems to defend, that's the real root of oppression.
And that right there is the central clash of the whole interview. Newman, she's coming from this place of systemic male dominance, whereas Peterson, he's pushing back against that framework with everything he's got.
So what evidence does she use to support this idea of patriarchal tyranny?
She points to some pretty stark statistics. The fact that men still hold a disproportionate amount of wealth and power, that women are often stuck with the burden of unpaid labor.
Those are undeniable facts. But Peterson doesn't actually dispute them, does he? It's more about how we interpret them.
Right. He's saying that just because these disparities exist doesn't automatically equal oppression. He also points out ways that men suffer. Higher suicide rates, higher rates of homelessness, workplace fatalities.
And he takes it a step further, arguing that Western civilization, while flawed, it's not some kind of tyranny, especially compared to other societies throughout history.
And to illustrate this, he brings up this really fascinating observation about gender roles in Scandinavian countries, you know, often seen as like the gold standard for equality.
Right, so you'd think more gender equality, men and women's roles would become more similar.
But the research actually suggests the opposite. Greater societal equality in these countries, it's correlated with an increase in differences between men and women, at least in certain career choices, and even some personality traits.
Wow, that's wild. It really flips the script, doesn't it? I mean, if men and women are becoming more different, not less, even in the most egalitarian societies, what does that say about the nature of gender?
That is exactly the question Peterson wants us to consider.
Yeah.
He's challenging this idea that gender is just or even primarily a social construct. And that's where his infamous lobster analogy comes in.
Ah, yes, the lobsters. Some love it, some hate it. What is it about these lobsters?
Well, to put it simply, he's using lobsters, these ancient creatures, to show how hierarchy is ingrained in nature, like way back. He points out that just like lobsters, we humans have this neurological and hormonal system that pushes us towards status, dominance, competition. It's all tied to serotonin.
He's not saying we're all just lobsters in suits.
Right. His point is more about the evolutionary roots of certain behaviors. These systems, these drives, they were around long before human civilization.
It's like he's saying even if we could hit the reset button on society, these patterns of dominance, these hierarchies, they'd likely reemerge. I can see how that would make some people uncomfortable. It calls into question how much we can really change about human nature, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And that's really just the tip of the iceberg. This interview goes on to explore free speech, political correctness, and a whole lot more. It's like this whole thing with the lobsters, right? It sets the stage for another big theme in the Peterson-Newman interview, free speech.
Yeah, Peterson's a huge advocate for free speech, even when it's controversial, even when people get offended.
He's got this saying like, suppressing ideas, even with good intentions, can be way more dangerous than just letting those ideas out there, letting them be debated openly.
Okay, but where's the line? What about hate speech? Speech that incites violence or discrimination, where does that fit in?
That's where it gets tricky. Peterson is careful to distinguish between speech that's just offensive and speech that's actually harmful. He says blurring those lines, that's a slippery slope. It can lead to censorship of legitimate viewpoints.
Which I guess connects back to his concerns about what he calls compelled speech. The idea that people could be legally forced to use certain language, certain pronouns, even if it goes against their beliefs.
Exactly. He sees that as a huge threat to individual liberty, a dangerous precedent to set.
And you know what's really interesting is he doesn't shy away from topics that are often considered off limits. Like he jumps right into the whole transgender issue, which is about as sensitive and hotly debated as it gets these days.
And it's true, his stance on that issue has definitely drawn a lot of criticism.
For sure. But I gotta say, I respect his willingness to tackle those tough questions, to challenge the conventional wisdom, even on the most sensitive issues.
He doesn't shy away from the political side of these debates either. He's openly critical of what he sees as ideological bias in academia and the media. He even has a term for it, postmodern neo-Marxism.
And for those of us who aren't quite sure what that means.
Basically, he's saying that where traditional Marxism focused on class struggle, this new iteration, it's fixated on power dynamics between different identity groups. Race, gender, sexual orientation, you name it.
So instead of seeing the world through the lens of economic class, it's about power struggles based on identity.
Right. And Peterson is concerned that this focus on group identity over individual merit or responsibility, it's pushing us towards a more divided, more polarized society.
Which, of course, is the opposite of his vision for the world, where people are empowered to take ownership of their lives, to strive for meaning and purpose.
It's kind of ironic, isn't it? Both sides are talking about power, but they're approaching it from totally different angles.
It's like they're playing two different games on the same board.
And that difference in perspective, I think that's a big part of why this interview blew up the way it did. It wasn't just about these specific topics. It was about two completely different worldviews colliding head-on.
It's almost like they're speaking different languages, even though they're both speaking English.
And that's why this interview still matters today. It highlights how difficult it is to have nuanced conversations, especially in our current media landscape where sensationalism often trumps substance.
Especially with social media in the mix. It's like an echo chamber, just amplifying those divisions, making it harder to find common ground.
Exactly. And we can't forget, this interview happened back in 2018, which was already a super politically charged time, lots of anxiety about social change in the air. So when we look back on it, we're not just analyzing a conversation, we're analyzing a cultural artifact.
Like a snapshot of a specific moment in time.
Exactly. A snapshot that continues to spark debate, discussion, even years later.
It really speaks to the power of ideas, doesn't it? To capture our collective imagination. Even when, or maybe especially when, those ideas are challenging, controversial.
And it brings up this really important question. If Peterson is right, if these patterns of hierarchy and dominance are so ingrained in us, in our biology, in our evolutionary history,
then is a truly equitable society even possible?
are we fighting a losing battle against our own nature?
Those are some big questions, huh? Not a lot of easy answers there.
That's kind of what a deep dive is all about, isn't it? Peeling back the layers, exploring the complexities, and hopefully coming out the other side with a little more understanding, even if we don't have all the answers perfectly packaged and tied up with a bow.
You know, it's funny, we keep talking about this interview as this battle of ideas, but it also kind of highlights how limiting language can be.
Oh, totally. Peterson and Newman, I mean, they're both smart people, well-spoken, but there are times when it feels like they're just talking past each other, you know? Like using the same words, but they mean totally different things.
It's more than just semantics, though, right?
Way more. It gets at how we interpret things, evidence, how we frame our arguments, how we see the world. It goes back to that whole postmodern neo-Marxism thing Peterson talks about.
He sees it as a threat to free speech, to open inquiry.
He's saying it shuts down debate,
Yeah.
by just dismissing certain viewpoints, not just as wrong, but as dangerous, harmful.
So no point in even having a conversation.
Exactly, which kind of connects to that broader point he makes about ideological possession, like
Yeah.
getting so attached to an ideology that you're blind to its flaws, its potential for dogma, tyranny even.
Don't just accept what you hear, even if it's coming from someone you agree with,
Question everything. Think for yourself. You might even be wrong.
which is kind of a humanist perspective when you think about it.
Right. Individual critical thinking, engaging with different points of view, even when, or especially when, you disagree.
That's got to be one of the biggest takeaways from this whole thing, even if you don't agree with everything Peterson says.
Yeah, because this interview, it forces us to really think about these big, messy questions. Gender, power, truth.
And real life? Well, it rarely has easy answers.
Nope, it sure doesn't.
Mm.
And we don't have to agree with every single thing Peterson says to appreciate that he's willing to shake things up, get people talking. But we do have to acknowledge that he's a polarizing figure, to say the least.
To put it lightly.
He's been called transphobic, misogynistic. People have even accused him of being alt-right.
Yeah, those are serious accusations. We can't just ignore those.
Definitely not, but it's crucial to engage with his ideas, not just these labels that get thrown around.
Exactly. And regardless of where you stand on Peterson, agree with him, disagree with him, his ideas, they've struck a nerve, clearly. His work has resonated with millions of people all over the world.
It seems like a lot of young men, especially who feel like they're disillusioned or alienated by the current cultural climate.
Which is important, right? Because even if you find some of his views problematic, even offensive, you can't just write him off as some fringe figure.
His popularity means something. He's tapping into something real, something a lot of people are feeling.
And that, to me, is the big takeaway. This interview started a conversation, and it's still going strong.
It's challenged us to confront some uncomfortable truths about ourselves, society, the whole shebang.
Which is what these deep dives are all about, right?
Yeah.
We're here to dig a little deeper, get into the weeds on some of these complex issues.
Exactly. And maybe, hopefully, come away with a little more understanding. We may not have all the answers perfectly tied up, but
that's okay. So
Yeah.
next time you see a headline, something about Jordan Peterson, maybe another controversial figure, don't just react. Take a breath. Dive into the material yourself.
you might be surprised what you find.
Who knows? You might even find yourself in a really fascinating conversation. That's it for today's deep dive into the Peterson-Newman interview.
We hope you enjoyed it.
Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss our next deep dive. And as always, keep asking those tough questions.